this session was called Decolonizing Gulf Cinema, and what exactly we mean by colonizing, and what we're aiming for this afternoon. So last time, I think, some of, when I say last time, I think that was last year. I think some of the attendees here, at least one or two, might have attended the last one, which I think they're thematically connected, but what I'm focusing on today is more about um, decolonizing the mind, in terms of how we view ourselves as Arabs specifically in the Gulf, and more precisely how we view ourselves through cinema. And part of the aim, at least, of this session is to rethink how we make films, to rethink how we produce them and how we distribute them, and also to take ownership of what we have. The other reason is, I mean, there's an entire scholarly kind of content about the decolonization in general, not just in the Gulf, but in the Arab region. It's a very huge and important topic, not specific only to cinema, but but also that also applies to a lot of different arts and academia as well. Um, so, by what we mean by decolonizing here is to kind of move away and detach ourselves from the colonial past. And we're going to see a lot of examples. I think it's already prevalent in the photo that I have in the background here, which was specifically, showcases the different interpretations and stereotypes of Arabs in Hollywood and American films and European films as well. Um, it's very interesting. Probably, I'm assuming it's a coincidence that this session is on the date of 9/11, which that specific date had also made a very big shift into how Hollywood portrays Arabs in cinema as well. But that's not to say that that was not already the case in the early ages of Hollywood, especially the golden age in the 30s. That was still there, and ongoing. Um, I don't know if I have to introduce I just realized I didn't introduce myself. My name is Mohammed Sultan. I'm obviously a lecturer in Abu Dhabi University for media production. I have a couple of side jobs. I'm also a co-founder of Asheron Pictures, which is an independently owned production company in Bahrain. It's nothing big, it's very small, but we focus on independent films, specifically narrative films. So when I'm not teaching, I like to write, direct, and produce as well. Um, I think I found this article, just to kind of start with this. I kind of found this article actually this morning when I was doing a bit more research before the session. And I thought it was a very appropriate way to start our conversation about the whole concept of decolonizing the arts. And I think this encapsulates really the one of the major aims here. It's that um, what I think is really important here is to decolonize the mind. And what I mean by that is that well, one of the biggest problems that we have in producing films, especially in our region here in the Gulf, is that we tend to follow similar tropes that are used in Hollywood, and sometimes we unintentionally represent ourselves the way the West sees us and not the way we see ourselves. And that's one of the I think that's one of the dangers of this, one of the dangers of not understanding this whole concept of reviewing what we do. It's that we start to see ourselves through the eyes of someone else. And I think that's the biggest problem here. This article was really interesting, and I have I have a link here if anybody wants to take a look at it. Actually, I'm gonna stop for a second here. I don't know, Mrs. Ivy, is this being recorded, by the way? If it is, it's
Yes, yes,
okay,
it's
great, great. Because
recorded.
because I wanted to record in the beginning, I forgot to ask. Okay, great. So. The reason why I have this article here in on screen, it's that this was written right after the most recent live action version of Aladdin was produced. I think this was in 20, might have been 2022. I could be wrong. Actually, no, 2019. Was it 2019? This was written in 2019, so I'm assuming this was that's when the film was out.
Film was
Um,
produced in 2019.
Yes, yes, thanks, Said. So, the reason why I have this on screen is because I found it very interesting, and you guys can read the article later. I found it very interesting how the writer thinks that the live action adaptation was a step in the right direction. I'm going to argue otherwise, even though I think, as it says here in the article, at least in the beginning, the film features Tunisian, Egyptian, Indian, and Iranian actors from those origins and from that heritage. And what they're arguing in the article is that um, it is a positive thing that those are the actors that are representing these characters on screen. I'm not saying that that is not the case. I'm just saying that I don't think it's that simple, and I think it's very easy to have a Hollywood producer say, okay, we're just going to make a remake of an Aladdin film, and instead of casting white actors, we're going to cast Arab and Middle Eastern actors. It's very simplistic, and it's very it's very much only covers the surface, right? But what we want to talk about here is that the idea of the film Aladdin itself is in itself inherently colonial and Orientalist. It doesn't really change the fact whether it was using white or American or European actors, or whether it was using Arabs from that heritage. The problem with Aladdin is that it's an Orientalist point of view. It was directed by a white British guy. I think it was Guy Ritchie, who was a great director, by the way. He made really good films. Um, and it's produced by Disney, which is a Western production company. And that's really the problem here. The problem is that we still don't have ownership of our identity on the big screen. There are, of course, a lot of examples of this, and we're going to get into that later on, and we'll talk about what are the positives and negatives of the current examples that we have in the Gulf. Um, yeah, one of the questions I wanted to ask, or maybe one of the questions that some of you might be asking themselves is, why should we care about this? Why should I care whether, our cinema is colonized or decolonized? At the end of the day, I just want to have fun. I mean, that could be the case, although I don't think that you could call it a national cinema if excuse me, if the films that we're making are not representing us, or at least they're not representing us the way we see ourselves. The problem is that there are colonial roots in the cinema of the region. In fact, one of the first movie picture houses when the first picture house that was made in the Gulf was in Bahrain. I'll show you guys a picture of that in a second. Um, and so and that picture house was basically created by the colonial by British colonialists, and they showed very specific kinds of films, so that's another story as well. um, the other reasons are also regarding the identity. If you want to have your own identity on screen, you have to make it yourself. We're going to talk a little bit about genre and why I think that's important as well, because that has a very special case as well. And then we'll get into the experimental and the avant-garde, which I think it's not exactly the most, digestible genre of film, but I do think that it's very important to have in every region. It's almost like an anti-cinema. Okay, so um, in if we look at the brief history. By the way, I don't know if you guys are typing for me or somebody else. I just wanted to double check real
No,
quick.
Mr. Muhammad,
Okay.
I'm just announcing to them that because
Oh,
the
exactly.
mic is disabled, they can write in the chat if they have questions.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Okay, thanks for letting me know, Ivy. I just wanted to double check in case I was missing anything. All right. So yeah, quick history. 1937, that was the first cinema in the Gulf. It was in Bahrain. Coincidentally, the first screening that was ever done was a musical of Kulthum, which is called Widad. That was in 1936. So notice it's almost so that film was basically I think actually I think I mixed up these dates. I think the cinema was 36 and this film was 37. Anyways, so in any case, it's almost like the conception at least of the idea of cinema in the Gulf is in itself already very late compared to other regions like North Africa, for example, more specifically Egypt. If you go back to Europe and America, picture houses were there in the late 1890s, early 1900s, such as Nickelodeons and all of that. So the introduction of cinema was through the West, which is already a problem. And then the early film productions, of these, regions here in the Gulf were very, very Orientalist. What I mean by that is that the people who were used to produce films about us were not even Arabs and were not specifically locals from the region. In fact, it was only until 1971 that the first film was produced in the Gulf, and it was a Kuwaiti film called Bas Ya Bahr. Um, it was an interesting film. It's not groundbreaking in any sense. It's an interesting, it has an interesting perspective, and I think it's very important to study because it's one of the few examples of early Gulf films that we have, because after that it just descended into television, and television became the predominant force of media entertainment. A lot of the films that were produced later on were, one-offs, and you had these independent films that came out in the 90s in Bahrain and in Kuwait, a few in Saudi. We're going to talk a little bit about Saudi later because I think it's the most important current example of Gulf identity in this time. Anyways, so this is all to say that the roots of cinema here was colonial. If we move on to the just look at some examples of these pictures. This was a picture of the first cinema in Bahrain. And these are just some examples of the early films that were shot. Early films that were shot in the Gulf were usually produced by, the wives of colonialists. And because these are films made by the Brits, it almost you can't really say that they're Bahraini films or Kuwaiti films or any of that because they're not really made by the people from that land. And there's a very big argument about that as well, because when we later on when we come to the current time that we're in right now, we're going to face similar problems with you might have, for example, a film that stars people from the Gulf region, but then the director is, someone from France or someone from America, which doesn't really solve the problem that we have. Anyways, so the issue of um, colonialism. Oops, spoiler again. The issue of colonialism here is that the perspective that we have of ourselves. The perspective that we have within cinema is an Orientalist perspective. This Orientalism was coined and introduced, very famously by Edward Said, who was looking at how how British and European colonialists were viewing the East as, exotic and fetishized and all of that. So the representation of Arabs, for example, in early, Hollywood cinema is going to look very fairy tale-like, and it's not exactly an accurate representation of reality for one very important reason, of course, which Edward Said used to, emphasize, is that the um, uh, the problem is that the West would see the Arab region as this one kind of archetype, right? So if they show a picture of, if they want to represent an Arab, for example, in a film, it would be someone like this, like this, one of the early films of Paramount called The Sheikh, which of course was starring Rudolph Valentino, who's obviously not an Arab. This is like the most common stereotype, and this is exactly what Edward Said was talking about. It's that there's this view of Arabs as this, one kind of entity, where if you actually live in the Middle East, you'll notice that every country will, regardless of whether we're all Arabs and we're connected by these, some similar traditions. The problem is that you'll go to Egypt and they have very different customs than Morocco. They have very different customs than, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi. They might be neighboring countries, but it doesn't mean that they all have the same culture. Because, I mean, you guys probably know this. I mean, especially if you grew up here in Emirat or anywhere in the Gulf, even though we have similar or we have similarities in our culture and traditions, there are those specificities within these countries themselves are what make them unique. And the problem with Orientalism is that it kind of captures this overarching view and this almost distorted view of what an Arab should look like versus, the diversity in the Arab world. So if we look at different examples of, Hollywood films, from the 50s and 60s all the way until right now, we'll notice the same, stereotype over and over again. When we look at any of these films, we, we don't really know exactly where it's located. I mean, obviously, the example on the top right is from Lawrence of Arabia, which is supposed to be set in modern Saudi Arabia, but the rest of the films have this, constant Orientalist point of view. And other than the fact that all the characters are, Arabs are always, portrayed in a very specific visual manner. Like if it's a woman, it's usually a belly dancer. If it's a guy, he's wearing a ghitra and a gal and all of that. And they're usually angry and they're, they have a big beard or whatever. And the other problem is with Orientalism is that not only does it conflict all the different Arab regions, but it would also include, the neighboring countries. So, like if you go to Iran and Afghanistan and, all the other neighboring countries, they might, some of them might share, a similar religion, which is Islam. The problem is that, every country that you go to around the Middle Eastern region is in itself a unique, inherently unique country with its own unique history. So a lot of problems here when it comes to representation. If we go back to one of the earliest examples, apart from it being an extraordinary animation, this is an exam. This is a film from I think it's from 1910, if I'm not mistaken, or 1914, really early 1910s. One of the earliest animations in, I think it came from Europe, from Germany specifically. It's called The Adventures of Prince Ahmed, which is inspired by Arabian Nights, which in itself is an Orientalist, or at least a text that was used by Orientalists. Very interesting film visually, but again, it begins to portray the very same tropes that we're talking about. The representation of, the Middle East as this one entity, the representation of Arabs from all over the region as these one specific, the specific generic, character. And the other thing is that it exotifies the Arab world as this exotic other that is like mystified, this mystical. Sorry. It's a very interesting film to look at, and I do recommend watching it, having keeping in mind the problems that it has. The examples that we can see later on coming out from Hollywood are all the different uh, Arabian Nights inspired films like Thief of Baghdad, Aladdin, and all of these films that, again, have the same recurring problems. We can see similar tropes, the exoticism, the stereotypes of Arabs. It's almost like there's this idea, there's this stereotype that is not even, this surreal stereotype of an Arab person. We look at examples that were produced later on in the mid 2000s. There's an extraordinary film by I think the name of the director was Tarsim Singh. He's an Indian-born director working in Hollywood, made really, really fantastic films that were visually striking. Again, we're starting to see the same problem here. There's an evolution that we're noticing when it comes to the visual factor, but these films still retain that common stereotype and common Orientalist point of view. And not to mention all the other examples that we have that are produced in the Arab region, but and we'll talk about why I feel like some of these examples are problematic. Actually needed that sip of coffee. We'll talk about why these were problematic. It's because the way that these characters look, even though this was a historical piece, of course, message, the way these figures look are very close to the figures that are being represented in the Arab in the sorry in the context of Hollywood. The message or Risala in Arabic was a very interesting film, and I think it's one of the most important historical moments in Arab cinema, because it's one of the first, probably the only film that was attempting to unify with still remaining these complexities within the Arab region. What I think is great about the message is that it was produced, first it was produced by an Arab director, Mustafa Al-Aqad, who unfortunately was killed, I think, years afterwards in a terrorist attack. And the great thing about this film is that for the first time, you have someone who may have had experience in Hollywood, but at least somebody from the region to tell the story of the people from that region. So I think this was a step in the right direction, at least at the time. The problem is that the films that would come afterwards from the region itself, it's almost like there's this point of stagnation where we still have to continue having these recurring themes of stereotypes, these recurring stereotypes of the Arab man and the Arab woman, and so on and so forth. Going to the industry in the Gulf, since the whole point of this is to talk about not the entire Arab region, but specifically the Gulf region, which I think is a very special case because, the first question we ask ourselves is, do we even have a film industry in the Gulf? And in many Gulf countries, the answer is no. not at least not in the traditional sense. Like in Bahrain, there's no film industry. I mean, there's no. And what I mean by industry is that it's almost like when you go to Hollywood, when you go to Bollywood, um, the film industry is almost like a factory. These films are coming out almost every single day, and we have like hundreds of films coming out a year. There are many different film companies. Some of them are independent films. Some of them are studio led, and there is a framework that is being set by the country itself to make the production more streamlined. There are attempts of a film industry in the Gulf, but I would not, at least myself, I would not call it an industry. There are attempts here in the UAE, which I think are great. They're probably the best example in the Gulf is in Saudi Arabia, and I think it's getting very, very close to that, if not maybe even there by now. Um, and I'll get into Saudi Arabia even a little bit more in a second. Um, the one thing that I feel is confused a lot, or a lot of people confuse here in the Gulf, is that they confuse the TV industry with the cinema industry, and television is really not cinema, right? Cinema is a social experience. When you go to a film, you go to it with a group of people, and that's one of the biggest distinctions between television and cinema. Not to mention the time frame of the film and the length of a TV show. Other than obviously the visuals and all of that. Um, I don't think. I mean, I think there are many different reasons as to why we don't have a film industry. However, I think the main reason is there is a lack of talent. And what I mean by that, I don't mean that the people are not talented. I just don't think that there are enough, filmmakers that are trained in this medium to be able to kind of create this industry from the ground up. I think these things take a lot of time. It's not only about investment, which is I think what Saudi's trying to do, but it's also about how can he train this local talent to be able to be fit to produce these films on a regular basis. I think what's happening in Saudi is very interesting. They are um, employing some. I mean, they're importing some, of some European and American producers and directors to be able to go to Saudi and co-produce along with the local population. That way, it will help the talent to grow in Saudi, and then eventually you'll have your own Saudi Arabian cinema. The reason why I mention that is I think Saudi Arabia has some of the best examples, even though I think some of them are not exactly up to the standards of what we would see, for example, in Hollywood or in Bollywood or even in Europe. But I think it's the closest thing to have, a cinema with a national identity. Um, there are many reasons for this. I think the most obvious reason, of course, which is something that you can measure, which is the amount of the population there. Saudi Arabia has a huge population, and you can have a sustained internal cinema. You can release a film in Saudi. For example, there was a film that was released a couple of years ago called Sattar. And to show you how strong the Saudi market is, by the time that film came out, I think at some point it had more people attending it than Avatar. That's something that is not exactly possible unless you have a huge local population, right? Six Windows in the Desert is one of the examples that I wanted to talk about here, because I really think that is one of the most interesting attempts to get into this mainstream cinema market. Six Wonders in the Desert is it's not exactly a film, but it's a collection of short films that were produced with in cooperation with Netflix. Anybody can watch it on Netflix right now. And it just showcases not only showcases the interesting talent that's in Saudi, but because it's produced mainly by Saudis, whether they're directing, producing, writing, and even acting in them, you can really see the Saudi identity, which is very specific in these films, right? Some of the themes that are being discussed in a lot of these films are very specific to Saudi. And, a lot of times, even as a Bahraini, I'm watching this, I'm like, oh, this is interesting. I didn't even know that this was a problem, for example, in Saudi, or this was a tradition there. And that shows you the depth of a complexity that you can come out with when you have a locally produced cinema. The same thing with Khalat, which I think it's even a more groundbreaking example. Um, the stories that are being told in this film, again, it's an anthology film. It's one story after another with different characters and different cast members. And the entire theme is, just discusses local problems, but it tells them it's almost like in a thriller genre, which is very, very interesting. If nobody's seen this, I would highly, highly recommend you watching it. I think it's still on Netflix. Moving on to genre. Reason why. Okay, sorry, Siri. The reason why I think genre is very important in the case of locally produced cinema and decolonizing is that a lot of the films that are being made, and when I say genre films, by the way, I'm specifically talking about films that are like horror films, comedy films, films that are specifically oriented towards specific genre. Um, there are a lot of attempts at this in the Gulf region, and I think it's very important to understand the effects of this because genre usually embeds itself within the local culture. So, for example, if you go and you watch a horror film that's produced, in Japan, um, the things that the Japanese people fear is very, very different than what people in India would fear, what Europeans would fear. And the reason for that, I mean, of course, there are many reasons, but a very important reason is because as genre is very culturally specific, and the fears of a specific culture are, have a lot of historical roots that are tied to that specific culture and tradition. In the Gulf region, it's kind of a different case. Of course, there are some exceptions, but genre is filled with Western tropes, and I think that's a very important thing to point out. And I really think if we are to decolonize cinema here in the Gulf, I really think that it should start with genre films because that's really where you can make it more and more culturally specific. And the reason why I say that, before I move on to the next slide, is because genre is something that's easy to travel. Like it travels very easy. Like a horror film can travel easily to the international market, but it can still retain its own cultural specificities. So these are some examples of films that were produced in the Gulf. I mean, so a lot of them are not that great, at least, some of the ones that I'm going to talk about in the beginning. And I think part of the reason why a lot of these films were not either commercially successful or even, financially, it's because they lack that cultural specificity. So Jin was a film, I think it was made in the mid 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and you can see even from the poster itself, it's almost written as a marketing strategy from the director of The Poltergeist and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And when you see this, you think, oh, this must be great. But because it's directed by someone who does not understand the culture, there are a lot of Western tropes in it. And, going back all the way to Orientalism, what we talked about in the very beginning, how the West views us as Arabs. And the other thing is that because it's made by somebody who doesn't understand the culture, hasn't lived here for a very long time, you end up having a lot of these stereotypes. And it's basically a Western horror film made in the UAE. That's basically what it ended up with. The same thing with this film, which was produced a lot more recently. It's called Cello. Again, we have a combined cast of Western, famous Western actors and some very famous Khaliji, actors and actresses, and it's again directed by someone who's not from the region, and then you basically end up with a Western film that is set in the Gulf. What we tend not to, what I think, there's a recurring theme here, or recurring mistake. It's that we think that the Hollywood visual, I know a lot of students say this word as well. It's like cinematic. What we think about when we say cinematic is we think of a Hollywood film or a film that was made in the West, and we don't necessarily need to make films like them. I mean, we can make films the way we want to make them, and maybe the way we make cinema is using different kinds of framing. Maybe it's using different kinds of compositions. It could be a lot of things. Some of the most recent examples, which were at least attempts at creating a more local, genre film, but I still think they're problematic because they're using, they're using almost the same. I wouldn't say stereotypes because the characters are kind of quite, different than Western characters. But using a genre like found footage, for example, it's still shot as if it's a Western film. However, I really think this is really, I mean, if you compare this to Jin, for example, I really think this is heading in the right direction. At least it's always using local talent, to produce it, using local talent to direct it and write it, and so on and so forth. Um, Again, another more recent example from Saudi is Naga. It's a lot more stylistic, even though, I may have a lot of problems with the film in general. But what I like about this is that it experiments with the genre, and there is a directing style from the director himself, who used to be a very well-known director of short films. And actually, he's a very talented guy, Mish'al Al-Jasser. Um, Again, I think what we learn from these two examples is that you can make a genre film, you can make a horror film that is set in, whether any Gulf region, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or in the Emirat or in Bahrain or whatever, and it could and with still retaining its own cultural, specific, tropes or specific traditions and so on and so forth. I think it's, when it comes to this idea of genre and how to apply it to a specific culture, I think it's really important to look at other precedents, right? So if you go to Japan, for example, I think I mentioned it earlier, is that a lot of these Japanese directors who were tackling this genre, especially in the early 2000s. And by the way, these films traveled really well to the point that they became, international, cult films. Um, the way that they approached it is that they made horror films the way that you know they would make other genres. Japan has a long history in cinema. They have prominent filmmakers such as Kurosawa and Kobayashi and all of these guys. And there's this long tradition of Japanese filmmaking, which is then later on applied to horror cinema as well. A more recent cinema industry is the cinema in South Korea, and I think it's the biggest international successes at the moment, especially after Parasite won the Oscar in I think it was a couple of years ago. I can't remember. I think it was 2019, if I'm not mistaken. Um, South Korean films have become one of the most dominant, films and even, TV shows nowadays. They compete with other films from around the region and even over the all over the world. And it's very interesting to look at the way that they approach genre films as well. And the reason why I'm giving these examples is I think that when you look at how these directors tackle these genres, you'll see how different they are from the West. And I think that's the best takeaway from this. Like, how can we take this idea as filmmakers here in the Gulf, and how can we apply it to our own cinema? How can we make our own films and have them be more unique? This is again another example from Europe. Anyways, I don't want to take too long with these examples. There are also examples of experimental and avant-garde films. And just a quick note on this, I really think this is very important, mainly because there should always be a non-mainstream cinema, because this is where the ideas of visual expression are explored. This is where you break rules, and this is where you come up with new ideas that are not in the mainstream yet. Um, One last thing before we wrap up is something I've also I think covered in a separate lecture, but I think is really relevant here, is that the idea of using independent cinema as a form of decolonization. And up until now, we've been talking about decolonizing films through the deconstruction of stereotypes, through making cinema locally, through detaching the Western perspective from our own perspective. I think one of the best, another great way to approach this is to focus on independent cinema. And when I say independent cinema, I say independence from all of the senses, right? So we're talking financially independent, we're talking independence in exhibition and in distribution as well. And I'll explain those in a second. Um, why is this important? I think number one, it gives us agency when it comes to making the films that we want to make as people from this region, and not adhere to Western tropes. Having some kind of self-expression, and I think self-expression, it may as well be the most important reason for us to make films. And not only that, but also self-reflection as well, right? Because when we look at the big screen, this is when we reflect on our own traditions, our own, selves, our own ideas, our own ideologies. There's also an artistic expression side of this. If we don't have our own independent cinema, we're not going to express ourselves in art the way we want to make, or the way we want to express ourselves. Of course, when it comes to national cinema, I don't think you can have a national cinema without having an independence in local financing, or at least the majority of the financing should be locally collected. I think in general there should be a decolonization of the arts. It's not just specific to cinema. I think art in general should be decolonized. There should be a we should look back at the way we were used to produce art, and we should revisit it and reevaluate the purposes of our own art. I think when it comes to the experimental and the avant-garde, I don't think that that kind of genre is possible outside of the independence scene. So some of the examples of independent films that were directed, that were produced in the Arab region in general, and at least to kind of look at them and see what we can learn from these experiences. Wajda, for example, was, at least at the time, it was marketed as the first film, the first Saudi film from a female director, which was a very, important thing at the time. In fact, Haifa Mansour is a has become a very influential figure, not only in the Gulf, but in the Arab region. Um, Even though she went on to produce some films in Hollywood, she still makes Saudi films in Saudi Arabia. Her last film, I think it was called The Perfect Candidate, is a fantastic film. I really highly recommend it. As I open my eyes, I believe it's a Tunisian film, Baraka Meets Baraka, the one on the third poster. It's I don't think it's the best Saudi film. I just think it's a really good attempt at trying to make a rom-com, even though I feel like it retains some of the tropes, but it still has these culturally specific moments that I think are interesting to watch. And Chef Jackson, which created a buzz when it came out from Egypt, I think it's a very good example of what you can do with independent cinema. That the kind of stories you can tell with independent cinema that would otherwise not work in mainstream cinema. Um, so when we think of independent cinema, we might think of films that are, independently financed, maybe co-produced by, some other European countries, but they're still mainstream, right? The examples that I think are even more interesting that we could learn from and we can hopefully apply one day here in the Gulf are examples of independent films that, artistically specific. Here I'm talking about, films that are, created by auteurs, films that, that take that genre or take that stereotype and flip it on its head. Nasser Khamir is I think one of the most underrated filmmakers from the Arab region. I believe he's also Tunisian. Um, his films are, very specifically, his films specifically deal with, the ideas of Sufism, and they're very much kind of connected with this idea of Orientalism, but it's almost like he's taking Orientalism and, reinterpreting it from his own point of view, which is very, very interesting. His films are very hard to find, which is another problem that we have. But I highly recommend, searching for them and finding them somewhere. Um, these are this is what his films are inspired by. It's inspired by these, old Islamic miniatures, which are just, beautifully constructed. Just a few more examples. We have Kawthar bin Hania, which recently won, I think, the Silver Lion or the Golden Lion yeah, in Venice Film Festival. She's a very, very well-known filmmaker, very influential. The films that she makes, they're heavily political, but they're also portraying the, Arab experience or the human condition from an Arab perspective. It's very, very different and unique. And last but not least, of course, Elias Sleiman, which is a Palestinian-born filmmaker who makes probably the most unique films from the region, a little bit inspired by Charlie Chaplin, but he has a very unique style. And I think, if we're gonna learn something, from all of these independent directors who are working in the Middle East, is that the other important factor about having an independent cinema is having your own personal artistic style. And I think, the more control you have as a filmmaker and as a producer on your own work, the more personal that work is going to be. Um, and to kind of wrap this up, I think when it comes to decolonizing cinema, um, even though decolonizing the artistic expression is very, very important, I also think that it will not be able, or it will not work without decolonizing distribution and exhibition as well. I think there are very important players in this game here. Cinema Aqil is a wonderful example, which is based in Bay, which is probably the only independent art house cinema that we have in the Gulf. I think there's another one that recently opened in Saudi. I think it's in Riyadh or in Dammam. I can't remember. I forgot the name of that. Other forms of distribution that could help with distribution are Qumra, which is a Doha Film Festival. Sharjah Film Platform is also a really good platform that helps young and new talented filmmakers to get into the scene. And when it comes to distribution, I mean, obviously, when it comes to film festivals, we have one of the biggest ones in Saudi, which is the Red Sea Film Festival. There are very small and unique examples of other ways of film distribution and film production in the Middle East. One of them is Indie Soog, which which is based in Bahrain right now, and I believe they're expanding soon to the Gulf, which is a crowdfunding platform for Khaliji filmmakers and Arab filmmakers in general. When it comes to distribution, I don't think we have enough. I mean, Front Row Films is one of the most well-known ones. We have Empire, which was, I think, started off or based in Lebanon, Cinewaves, which is in Saudi, and I think both Front Row and the plot pictures are UAE-based, distribution companies. I think distribution companies are very important. If we make films and don't distribute them ourselves, they're being distributed by, other Western companies. And I think part of decolonizing and ownership is to be able to exhibit and distribute films, within the region itself. Um, I think I think that is it. That's all I have for today. I really hope that I hope I wasn't rambling too much, and I hope I made sense out of what I said. I really want to thank everybody for tuning in, and I don't know if anyone wants to or has any questions. We can have a quick Q&A if anybody wants. There is a very long text here. Okay, thanks. Oh, thank you, Aisha. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much. All right. I think we have a few hands up. Abdulaziz. I think the mics are not going to be on, but Abdulaziz, if you want to... Okay, there you go. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum, Doctor. First of
There.
all, thank you so much for this amazing session.
Thank you.
I am talking to you from Sweden. I am a media student,
Okay.
but I thought this session is really good because of the valuable information you provided during the time. The thing I want to share is from my small opinion about the Gulf film industry. I think one of the reasons for why we are late in film industry is because on the local level we previously we didn't know the difference between filmmaking and media and television. If someone would like to study filmmaking, they go and study media, which is more traditional media. But as you said, in the late attempts, for example, by Saudi, we are seeing a really good development, and I think this area will, of course, will share something to the world.
Thank you, Abdulaziz. And I think you bring up a very important point here, which is, the role of academia, right? And you're very right. There's a lot of a lot of examples, especially early on, of young filmmakers who want to specialize in this field, and because film education in the Gulf, at least, there are very, very few places that, at least not, I mean, there are more now, but at least at the time, there weren't any that would allow you to specialize in film specifically. And we still have this problem. There's this problem of conflicting cinema with broadcast, for example, or having media as a general term. And I think you're very right in saying that there is, that problem is very prevalent. I also think that it's not only a problem of film education, but it's also a problem of film viewership, right? So that's again going back to that whole reason of why I was talking about the early examples of cinema in the Gulf. It's because the films that we're used to watching are films from the West. Because we're not watching ourselves on the screen, we're used to seeing Americans or Europeans on the screen. So we think that, oh, that's the way to make it. I think one of the examples I want to give before I answer the other questions, the first class I was teaching here in Abu Dhabi, one of the projects I received from a student, who's a very talented student, and he wrote a script, and I was reading the script, and the characters in the script were called John and Tom and Tim, and I was asking him, do you know anybody with those Western names? And that's when we started having that conversation. It's because we're used to watching films, we're used to watching Western media, and we just involuntarily kind of got sucked into that tornado. Malak, you were saying, could you share some more subtle, less obvious stereotypes, ways that students or filmmakers might unintentionally reproduce colonized Orientalist ideas in their films, maybe ideas you personally seen recurring in films adhering to Western cinema with genre. So I can't think of anything from the top of my head. I think the example that I just gave, that's probably one example. The other examples that I would give is, stereotypical tropes within storytelling itself. So, and that's also a problem that we as instructors have, because when we teach these courses, a lot of times we have to start with the standard, for example, narrative structure, right? So, the three-act structure, beginning, middle, and end. When in fact, if we go back to, our Arab culture, a lot of, Arab writing, especially early on, I mean, if you go back to even like the early books of Najib Mahfoud and Taha Hussein, a lot of that narrative was fragmented. It wasn't, a lot of it was non-linear. And we seem to kind of forget our own tradition as well when it comes to writing. I think, again, we go back to that whole problem of that. Apart from the fact that there is a role when it comes to academia, I think we also should re-educate ourselves and look more into our own past rather than having someone else tell us about our past. I hope I answered your question slightly. We can talk a little bit more about that. Saeed, before I get to you, I think, let me see what Aisha wrote for a second. Do, 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 do. Let me see if there's a question there. I think on the film was. Okay. I get what you're saying there. You're welcome, Malik. No worries at all. Saeed, did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question,
Go
Mr.
ahead.
First of all, thank you for this lecture, محاضرة. Thank you.
No problem.
Secondly, I have seen, for example, since 2022 and 2025, this 3 years, the film industry in the Arab region, especially in Gulf, is improving. Like big time in Saudi for Turkish Sheikh, big time funds,
Yeah.
and Gia as well. Also in many Arab countries like Egypt, Algeria are improving. But in some cinemas, here and in the Arab country, the the audience is looking for foreign films, not Arab films. I want to know your opinion in this topic. And thank
Can
you.
you repeat the last part? You were saying that Arab countries want foreign films?
يعني
Yeah.
كل
I just want to
سؤال.
make sure. Yeah, I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. I think I think it's a lot of things. Some of it is, again, going back to what we discussed earlier about what we're used to watching. Um, the other thing is a lot of it is also culturally specific. So, for example, if you go to China, if you go to India, a lot of the films that are locally produced are mostly locally digested, right? So um, you do not have to convince someone in India or someone in China to watch a Chinese film or an Indian film because they have a tradition in that and they're used to watching that. Um, our some of our problems in the Gulf, specifically in the Gulf, I think, is that we are very self-critical. So when we see, and this is changing a lot, of course, but it's very common that when we go to the cinema and we see like a film that is produced locally, we think very lowly of it. We don't think that it can compete with the
Yes.
international market. Yeah. So it is partly on us as well. I think we should motivate ourselves more. And we should think more positively, but I do understand where that comes from. And we're also part of the reason is because we're used to watching films from the West, and I think it takes time for a local cinema to be, to grow. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. Aisha, I want to comment on something you said in the end, which is the phrase "the global South," and I really like that because it's something that I didn't get a chance to mention in this lecture. It's that even the phrases that we use, like the word Middle East itself, is very problematic, right? Because I mean, not to the I mean the first obvious fact is that there's no middle in a circle, right? And it's it's just we're living in a globe, so the idea of the Middle East is a Western idea. It's actually more correct to say West Asia for the Middle East because we're technically in the West Asian continent. But again, these are huge problems that we have, not only linguistically, but also historically. And I think a lot of these things should be revisited. If you look at academic texts, they're starting to do that. There's a lot of archiving that's being done. In fact, there's some amazing films that a lot of people haven't seen. And if you go to Egypt, there's a very fantastic filmmaker called Shadi Abdus He died a long time ago. Shadi Abdus was one of the most prominent independent filmmakers. I think in Iskandariya he has either a museum or part of the museum is displaying some of his work. And Saeed, you may know about him as well.
Yes. I think
What?
in اسكندرية library مكتبة اسكندرية
Yes.
في
Exactly,
جزء من
exactly.
مقتنياته وأشياء as well
Yes.
as نور الشريف.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think, those are names that are not very much well known in our region, even though I think they have made some of the most important films. They may not be commercially successful and they're very hard to digest, but I think part of the reason is because we're used to watching a standard Hollywood film with a three-act structure, with action, with, very common drama, or we're used to watching Khaliji dramas on our TV. So I think there is hope because I mean, obviously, with a lot of you here that are I mean, I was very happy to see that people are actually interested in these kinds of sessions, and I think this really brings me a lot of hope, right? So I at least know that there are people out there in the region who are interested in making this change. So that's something to be hopeful about. All right. Any other questions? Any comments? Great.
The last two questions, Mr.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's more technical, but I was wondering about the certificate of attendance and the lecture, if we can see it again anywhere or something.
Absolutely. So I think Miss Ivy can answer the first question.
Yes, for the
Yeah.
certificates, we are going to give it away. And also the recording of the session, we will be uploading it in our YouTube Connect channel. I'll put the link here in the chat.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Ivy, and thanks everybody for joining. I think Huda is typing. I don't know if she has a question or she's just commenting how wonderful my slides are. We'll see. We'll see how that goes. Oh, okay, no more. All right.
Yeah, hold on, Mr. Muhammad, just as an
There we
announcement.
go.
For anybody who are interested in all of the sessions that we are running, you can go to our EDU Learning app. So we have like a calendar there where we are posting all of the available seminars and sessions for it's open for everybody.
Thank you, Miss Ivy, and thanks, Huda, for sharing that. I absolutely agree. Let me just read out what you wrote quickly. I'll add. We see the same Bollywood cinema to the way the Pakistanis are portrayed and also the way South Indians are portrayed in Hollywood cinema. It is the same in the entire world. Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, one of the most bizarre things is when you watch a Hollywood film and they conflate an Indian person with an Arab person. I mean, having an Arab person in itself is already a very general stereotype, and then conflating them with, two different, regions in Asia is also even more bizarre. It just shows you how, the lack of, you know, perspective they have, I guess. But I absolutely agree. I do think that it's not only a problem in, with the portrayal of Arabs, it's pretty much a problem that you will find in a lot of big cinema industries. I mean, if you go to Europe, you will find the same thing. You'll see how how a lot of the populations from Africa are being portrayed in French films and German films, and the same thing in Bollywood with Pakistanis and South Indians in Hollywood, as you have correctly mentioned. Great. All right. Thank you all so much. This was very fun. I'm so happy that we have a significant attendance this time, and hopefully we can do more of these. I love talking about cinema, and yeah, happy to connect with all of you on LinkedIn as well. And yeah, I'll see you guys sometime, inshallah. Take care.
Thank you, Mr. Muhammad.
Mr.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye, Mr.